Welcome. I am Jason Grosser from the Memphis Free Thought Alliance. We are joined by Robert Boston, who is the Senior Advisor at Americans United for Separation of Church and State and editor of Church and State, Americans United's monthly membership magazine. On the topic of separation of church and state, Rob is an expert and has published many articles over the decades and written 4 books that you may want to read for more information about this topic, including his most recent book, Taking Liberties: Why Religious Freedom Doesn't Give You the Right to Tell Other People What to Do. With the recording, I missed the first 10 seconds or so, for which I apologize, where he was talking about facts and myths about our American religious history and how some people use myth more than fact to form a narrative about America being a Christian nation with a Christian government. With that said, I hope that you enjoy this informative and important talk, followed by our discussion with Rob.
May be a combination of facts and myths, conjecture, and the job of anybody who sort of follows these issues is to pull the factual data out from the myths and the aspirations and try to get to a point where we can really understand how we got to where we are. And with separation of church and state, that's really important because there is so much misinformation and bad information out there about this principle. Some of it is deliberately spread by Christian nationalist or religious right organizations who seek to, because they don't like the dominant factual narrative of American history, seek to substitute in another one. They are in that way like creationists. Creationists, being unhappy with the factual data of the theory of evolution, made up something else, which they called creationism. Now, it doesn't have any facts or data behind it, but they promote it anyway, and they try to replace the narrative of evolution with this religiously based doctrine instead. Same thing happens with our history. The religious right, the Christian nationalists believe we were founded as a Christian nation, and they promote that concept constantly, even though there's no factual data behind it. So we have to begin with our history. That's how we can understand how we got to where we are today. And oftentimes, when we're talking about history, and when we're talking about the question of the Christian nation myth, we really don't need to do anything more than look at the text of our own Constitution. And this is kind of an ironic thing because oftentimes you will hear very conservative people talk about themselves as being originalists or faithful to the text of the Constitution. Well, if that's the case, then the advocates of the Christian nation doctrine really need to just read the document itself. They need to read the Constitution, because nowhere in that document does it say that we are a Christian nation. Nowhere does it recognize Christianity for preferential treatment. Nowhere does it even mention God. It is a secular document. So oftentimes when you are confronted with individuals who argue that the country was founded to be a Christian nation, I would say the best answer to that is to simply respond, well, where does it say that in our Constitution? Point to the language, show me where that is. And they're really not able to do that because it's not there. Also, it's important to remember that the Constitution does contain a provision in Article 6 that guarantees the right of everyone, no matter what their religious beliefs might be, to hold public office. So public office at the federal level, at least, was guaranteed by our Constitution to be open to Christians and Jews and Muslims and Buddhists and non-believers, which would be a rather strange provision to put into a document that somehow preferenced Christianity or created a Christian nation. Now, this was all discussed and this was all argued at the time. There were people who believed that there should be some recognition of Christianity in the Constitution, and they argued for that and they advocated for that, but their side did not carry the day. So it's important to remember that this idea of a Christian nation falls mainly because it does not appear anywhere in the Constitution. But there are other things we can look at. There are other points of evidence. There are other historical data and facts that we can bring to bear when we're having this discussion with folks who believe that we were founded to be a Christian nation. One of the things we can look at is the political beliefs of the founding fathers. Now, when we talk about the founding fathers, obviously there's a lot of individuals who make up that body. But when it comes to religious freedom, there's really just a few who were very crucial to it, mainly Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Madison was the primary author of the First Amendment. He's considered to be the father of the Constitution. He was a protege of Thomas Jefferson. They worked very closely together to bring religious freedom to Virginia. So they were strong advocates for that. And they took that experience in Virginia with them, Madison, at the federal level when he was on the committee that drafted the Constitution. And remember, the Constitution, as originally written, didn't contain any provisions for religious freedom. That was added later, a few years later, when the Bill of Rights was ratified. But the political beliefs of the founders would not have led them to embrace the Christian nation concept. Remember, many of the founders, the key founders that we're talking about here, came out of a European experience. They were familiar with what had happened in Europe. They knew how religion and government had been merged there for hundreds of years, and all the conflict and tension and war and violence that caused. And because they were familiar with that experience, they did not want to replicate that on our own shores. And indeed, they didn't necessarily have to look to Europe, although they were students of history. They had seen examples of it in colonial America as well. Prior to the adoption of the First Amendment, and even after it, there were colonies and later states that had some type of preference for religion or some type of preference for a type of Christianity, and that they merged religion and government, and that there was persecution because of that. And there was many examples of people not having the freedom to choose what religion they would belong to or support because laws preference certain types of Christianity. Indeed, in Virginia, where Jefferson and Madison both lived, the Anglican Church was the established church in that state, and everybody had to support it, whether they belonged to it or not. Thomas Jefferson in 1776 wrote a bill that would have disestablished the Anglican Church in Virginia and guaranteed to every person the right to worship as they saw fit. Now, 1776, there were a lot of things going on. That's the year the Revolution started, so Jefferson was unable to get that legislation passed. But some years later, in 1785, James Madison, on Jefferson's behalf, did get the legislation passed. That's the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. The Virginia statute guarantees everyone the right to choose their own faith and disestablishes the Anglican Church as the official church of Virginia. Now, when this was being debated in the Virginia legislature, there were people who argued, well, we can have religious freedom, but we don't want to take it too far. So let's limit it just to Christians. Let's say that you can choose your own religion as long as it's a Christian religion. Well, that was defeated. That measure was defeated. And Jefferson rejoiced and reflected later that his bill protected, as he put it, the Jew and the Gentile, the Mohammedan, the Hindu, and the infidel of every denomination. So Jefferson had this very expansive view of religious freedom. Those concepts, the two concepts of the Virginia statute, no official church, religious freedom for everybody, were later taken up by James Madison when debate on the Bill of Rights began. And the Bill of Rights, as originally written, was actually 12 proposals. Two of them didn't make the cut. So what we know as the First Amendment was actually originally the Third Amendment. But that amendment guarantees, at the beginning, religious freedom, and I think codifies the idea of separation of church and state. So the Virginia experience was key to this, and was a very powerful influencer on the First Amendment and the religious freedom and the separation of church and state as we know them today. Well, sometimes people ask me, what about, this famous metaphor of the wall of separation between church and state that Thomas Jefferson wrote about in 1802? Where did that come from? Well, the First Amendment, as originally written, applied only to the federal government, applied only to Congress. Did not apply to the states. That didn't happen until after the Civil War. So there were still people, even after the passage and ratification of the First Amendment and adoption of the Bill of Rights, who were living in states where they had no religious freedom. One of those states was Connecticut. Connecticut had a Congregationalist establishment. Congregational church was established by law. Everybody had to support it. Everybody had to pay taxes to buttress it. And this angered especially the Baptists in Connecticut. A group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut wrote to Thomas Jefferson to express their support for his idea, his concept of religious freedom, which gave everyone the right to choose their beliefs as they saw fit. And in response, Thomas Jefferson wrote this letter that invoked that famous metaphor of the wall of separation between church and state. And Jefferson, in writing that letter, knew that it would become a public document, because back then that was a very common thing. Letters didn't remain private very long. And he wanted to be very exact in his language. He wanted to state what his beliefs were about religious freedom, because he wanted to really use the letter as a vehicle to make a major pronouncement on religious freedom. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. It was within a few days of receiving the letter, the Danbury Baptists in Connecticut had made it public, and it began appearing in newspapers. So this was more than just a casual response by Thomas Jefferson. And I point this out because one of the religious rights key arguments is that when Jefferson was responding to the Baptists in Connecticut, he didn't give it much thought. It was just a courtesy note. But in fact, the history of the letter proves exactly the opposite. Jefferson consulted with his attorney general before he wrote the letter. There were a couple of different drafts. He put a lot of thought into it because he knew it would become a public document, and indeed it did. So the political beliefs of the founders would not have led them to embrace the Christian nation concept. They did not believe that. They did not want there to be any kind of official religion in the United States. And they had allies in the clergy. Certainly there were clergy who advocated for church-state union, but there were many in the clergy who advocated for the opposite. John Leland was a very powerful Baptist cleric who lived in Massachusetts and for a while relocated to Virginia. He knew Thomas Jefferson. They were friends. They worked together to promote the idea of religious freedom. John Leland once said, "The notion of an officially Christian republic should be exploded forever." Even though he was a very devout man himself, he believed that religious freedom and freedom of conscience were absolute, and he advocated for that. So the political beliefs of the founders would not have led them to promote this Christian nation idea. What about their religious beliefs? Well, many of the key founders had Enlightenment-inspired views and adopted language that would either be considered deistic or rationalistic. You know, think about some of the phrases you hear about when you think about the founders and their religious beliefs. Think about some of the language that appears in the Declaration of Independence, which was written by Thomas Jefferson. You don't find direct references to Jesus Christ. Instead, you hear these deistic references, the deistic language. The God of the deists was a God that set the universe into motion, but then kind of stepped back from it. And that was a very common religious belief at the time. It's not so common today. Probably aren't a lot of deists around. I'm sure there are some, but not a lot. So when you hear the language of deism, it sounds a little jarring to today's ears because we're not familiar with it. But some of the phrases that the key founders used, George Washington spoke of the supreme architect of the universe. These are deistic terms. What a lot of the founders were interested in doing was creating a very rational-based religion. In Jefferson's case, for example, he admired Jesus as a moral teacher, but did not believe in his divinity, did not believe that Jesus performed miracles, did not believe that Jesus was born of a virgin or that he died on the cross and was resurrected afterwards. So these key factors of Christian doctrine were rejected by Jefferson. Jefferson, in fact, many of you probably know this, took a knife to the New Testament and cut out the passages that he did not believe in, and pasted up what was left, and created a document that we call today the Jefferson Bible. Its official title is The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. This was Jefferson's private devotional. And the Jesus that appears in this book is a very human figure. He performs no miracles. He makes no claims to divinity. He does not rise from the dead. He is a human figure. He has a moral philosophy which he imparts, but that's really all he does. So the idea of Jefferson and some of these other founders as being fundamentalists, as sometimes you hear argued today, is really kind of laughable when you look at their views. John Adams was a Unitarian. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson corresponded about religion extensively and discussed their beliefs a lot. And these letters exist. They've come down to us. You can read them today. John Adams did not believe in the Trinity and thought that some of the claims of conventional Christianity were, to be frank, absurd. The idea that there were three gods, the resurrection, these were not things that he necessarily accepted. George Washington was very deistic in his views. Nominally an Anglican, he would go to church but often leave before communion was served. In his writings, it's very clear that he believed that religion was necessary as a tool that could keep people in line or reinforce good behavior, but that it was possible to find a rationally based version of Christianity. And in fact, a lot of founders believed that this sort of rational Christianity would become the dominant religious view in America. Thomas Jefferson once expressed the opinion that most people in the United States would at some point adopt a form of rationally based Unitarianism. Now, Jefferson in that case was no prophet. We know that he was wrong about that. In fact, near the end of his life, the Second Great Awakening started and people began gravitating toward more evangelical belief systems. But it certainly was Jefferson's belief that a more rational-based religion was possible. Another line of evidence we need to look at when we're debunking the Christian nation story is what happened in the 19th century. When the Constitution was written and when it was released and when it became a public document and it was published in broadsides, pamphlets, newspapers, and that was the primary method of communication back then. Remember, in a pre-internet age, pre-radio, pre-television, people relied on the printed word to find out what was going on. So they could read this document for themselves. Some people were very angry that there were no references to Christianity or to Jesus or to God. They saw that the document was secular, and that kind of shocked some people, especially ministers. You can go back and you can read sermons from ministers from the early 18th century attacking the Constitution as a godless document. Well, eventually what happened is some ministers decided some years later, during the Civil War actually, that they would like to rectify that mistake, what they considered to be a mistake of the founders, by adding references to Christianity, God, and Jesus Christ to our Constitution. So they rewrote the preamble to the Constitution to make these references and to put them in. Explicit references to Christianity, officially stating we're a Christian nation. Now, it would not have been necessary for them to try this if the Constitution had somehow recognized Christianity when it was written, but it didn't. So they wanted to add that stuff after the fact. The so-called Christian Nation Amendment was introduced originally during the Civil War in the North, then later after the war. It reappeared in the latter half of the 19th century several times, and there were different versions of it. But essentially, it would have added these references to God, to Jesus Christ, and to Christianity to the Constitution, proclaimed that we were officially a Christian nation. It did get a vote in a House committee in the late 19th century, but obviously it didn't pass. It's not part of our Constitution. This proposal was being promoted by an organization of very conservative Protestant ministers who called themselves the National Reform Association. They had an agenda. There were a lot of things they wanted to do. They wanted to ban all forms of labor on Sunday. They wanted wide-ranging clerical censorship of reading material and other things. So they were like an early religious right organization. They pushed the Christian Nation Amendment. They had these votes in the late 19th century, but it did not pass. Strangely enough, it resurfaced in another guise in the 1950s. It didn't get much more traction then. It's not part of our Constitution. But my point is, if the Constitution had been written to officially embrace a Christian order, then this amendment would not have been necessary. But this group continued to push it for a long time. So that's a little bit about the Christian nation myth and debunking it and explaining why it's not accurate, why it's not part of the founding principles. So the question becomes, why did this idea of the Christian nation come to have such a powerful hold on people to the extent that we're still grappling with it today? And we are, believe me. I mean, I've worked at Americans United for 33 years, and I can't begin to tell you how many times I've had to debunk that idea on a talk radio program or in a blog post or some other medium. A lot of people really believe this. There's even been some polling data. You ask people if they believe, does our Constitution recognize Christianity? A disturbingly high number of people will say it does, even though it clearly does not. So the myth has a hold on people today. Why? Well, again, we need to go back to its origins. The Christian nation myth originated during the Civil War. Now think about what that time must have been like for people. You had this incredibly divisive, violent, bloody conflict that had torn the nation in two. Tens of thousands of people were killed. The infrastructure of the South lay in ruins. People who had been brought here enslaved were told they were free, but there really wasn't a plan to integrate them into society. And we know that their rights were not respected until a long time after. So you had this extremely cataclysmic event. And whenever something like that happens, a certain number of people will turn to very conservative forms of religion as a coping mechanism, because they need answers. Why has this happened to us? Why is our nation torn in two? Why is there violence, bloodshed, war, chaos, terror? And they will embrace extremely conservative forms of religion to provide an answer and to provide comfort. Well, that's exactly what happened with the Christian nation idea. It began to take hold, and people saw that as an answer to all this violence and this chaos. Today, I would argue that the Christian nation myth plays a bit of a different role. One thing it does for people is it provides them with the myth of our national goodness. Now, what I mean by that is this. A lot of people on the political right would like to believe this idea that our nation has always been especially favored by God, has always been good, has always been decent, has always done the right thing, and that it was our God-given right to possess the entire continent. Manifest destiny, from sea to shining sea. We hear echoes of this today. Just last month, President Trump announced that he was going to form a commission of historians to teach patriotic history because he doesn't like the history kids are learning in school. Now, any fair reading of our history knows what it's really been like. We brought people here in chains. We enslaved them. We devalued them. We denied their humanity. We killed them. We sold their children. We took the land from the native inhabitants by force or by fraud. We swindled. We suppressed the rights of women. We endured child labor. There have been a lot of things in our history that we need to face squarely. Now, that doesn't mean we haven't done good things too. We have. But a fair reading of our history shows the difficulty and the challenges and the times when we have not lived up to the inspiring words of our founding documents. But a lot of people don't want to face that. So they want to believe that we've naturally been good, we've naturally been loved by God, best among all nations. The Christian nation myth feeds that belief. It also feeds this idea that the people who embrace it, that there was like a great legacy out there, a stolen legacy. We had this great, wonderful Christian nation given to us by God, and it was taken from us. And who took it? Well, it depends on whatever enemy they want to tar. Maybe it's liberals. Maybe it's feminists. Maybe it's non-Christians. Maybe it's non-believers. Whoever they want to attack. Secular humanists. They took this from us. They took our Christian nation. We're going to get it back. It also, the Christian nation myth, I think also feeds into the fear of social change that a lot of people have in this country. If you think about what the country's been through since the 1960s, we've had a succession of rights movements, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the LGBT rights movement, and now we're seeing non-believer rights. And people have pushed those rights movements, and most of us would look at those and say that's a good thing. We want to expand human rights. Every time we do that, we all benefit. But there are people who are threatened by that, who very much yearn for an America where white male Protestants, generally speaking, were at the top of the heap. And everybody else was kind of considered a second class or lower type of citizen. So the Christian nation myth feeds that idea that they can be at the top of the pyramid again if we can just get back to that. It's also a means of political power for a lot of politicians, quite frankly. Politicians play that up. Oh, yes, we have this great, glorious Christian past. We're going to get back to that. I'm going to restore that. A lot of that comes out from the Trump administration. And although obviously on a personal level, no one really thinks of him as being a particularly devout man. But he has used that to great effect for political reasons, and he's not the only one. Revisionism also, I think, leads some people to a type of conspiracy theory style thinking, that the true history of the Christian nation has been suppressed by elites or college professors or whoever you want to believe. And I mentioned earlier creationism. It's a very similar type of situation. In fact, I sometimes call the Christian nation myth a form of historical creationism, because it leads people to embrace a conspiracy theory. Well, if you only knew the real story of the Christian nation, you would feel differently. Just like the creationists say, well, if you only knew the real story of how the world was formed, if you only knew the way those scientists are lying to us or have misinterpreted the data or whatever crazy claims they're making, in order to get people to come over to their side. So there's very much an idea of a conspiracy theory style thinking in this particular approach of the Christian nation myth. That's a little about where we have been. What about where we are? Well, I'm not pleased to tell you that it's not a particularly good place right now. And I think you all know that, especially in light of some recent events. We have a federal judiciary that is becoming increasingly conservative. The Supreme Court, which is now being stacked with appointments from President Trump, judges that have been screened by very conservative organizations, and we're in for some difficult times. And it gives me no pleasure to say that, but I feel that I have to tell you this straight up and without sugarcoating, because we're all going to be, over the next few years and several decades perhaps, grappling with the fallout from this. We are seeing situations where issues that we thought we had long settled, such as access to birth control, something that was settled in 1965, are suddenly back on the table. We're seeing situations where people are arguing that they should have a legal right to use their religion to discriminate against LGBTQ people, against Muslims, against women, against non-believers, against anybody they want. Again, something we thought we had settled back in the 1960s with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, which in part banned discrimination in venues that are open to the public. Yet now we see religious organizations and religious people arguing that they should have this right to discriminate. Now, let me be clear. A house of worship has the right to discriminate. A house of worship doesn't have to let you come there and worship if they don't think you should be there. And no one's trying to take that away from them. Houses of worship have an absolute right to decide to whom they will offer their sacraments and their services. But we're not talking about houses of worship here. We're talking about some guy who owns a bakery or a studio, photography studio, or an art studio, or even a lodging or restaurant. Suddenly people saying, we're not going to serve certain classes of individuals. Again, this was something that should have been settled back in the 1960s, because remember, that's exactly what African Americans had to put up with all during Jim Crow. People telling them, you can't come into this restaurant. We don't serve you here. You can't stay in this hotel. You cannot be served. We'll serve everybody else but you. Well, we thought we had eradicated that. Now it's back, and it's wearing the guise of religious freedom. People are seriously arguing that they have a religious freedom right to do these things. And over the past few months, we've seen people making even more unusual arguments about religious freedom, saying that religious freedom gives them the right to open their doors to in-person worship, even though just about every other thing out there is closed. Now, we know since the pandemic that a number of states have instituted public health orders that are curbing large gatherings. Earlier on, they were banned entirely in many states. But those bans treated secular and religious gatherings alike. You couldn't meet for a religious service, and you couldn't meet to hear a speech by a secular speaker, or to listen to a poetry reading, or to go to a concert, or to watch a play. You could not meet in large gatherings. As long as everybody's being treated the same, religious and non-religious alike, there shouldn't be a problem. But some religious organizations have been arguing we should have the right to meet anyway. Our right, our desire to get together and worship in person means we should have the ability to get together, even though there's a public health order. Now, the Supreme Court twice within the past few months on preliminary rulings did not accept that rationale. The Supreme Court felt that because secular and religious entities were treated the same, then it was acceptable to have these bans on mass gatherings. But now Justice Ginsburg is no longer with us. And the next time this issue comes up before the court, it can very well go the other way. And if religious organizations are suddenly given the right to start hosting giant services again, well, obviously that is a public health threat to all of us. So we'll have to see what happens, but that's a concern. We've seen a steady erosion of basic principles at the Supreme Court. Back in the 1970s, the Supreme Court handed down rulings stating quite clearly that you could not be taxed to pay for someone else's religion. They struck down various schemes to funnel money to religious schools. Well, the Supreme Court began shifting on that in the late 80s and into the 90s, and now has upheld voucher plans. So in some states, we're all paying taxes to support religious schools, even though we may not support what's being taught there. We've lost ground on things like the display of symbols, religious symbols in public spaces. A couple of years ago, the Supreme Court upheld the display of a gigantic cross in Bladensburg, Maryland, which is a DC suburb, because it was described as a war memorial when it was first erected in the early 20th century. But it is not a war memorial that represents everybody. Cross is the preeminent symbol of the Christian faith. That cross represents Christians who died in the wars. It doesn't represent anybody else. But the Supreme Court has allowed that to stand on publicly owned parkland in Maryland. So we've lost ground on a lot of things. And we may see some other issues that we thought were settled reopened, like the role of religion in public education. The school prayer cases are nearly 60 years old. They came down in 1962 and 1963. And the courts have been consistent since those decisions came down that public schools do not have the right to sponsor prayer and religious worship and pressure students to take part. But even that, we could see looked at again or eroded or chipped away with this extremely conservative, radicalized court that we've been stuck with. And believe me, there are plenty of Christian nationalist, religious right legal organizations that are out there eager to take these new cases up. There's a group called the Alliance Defending Freedom. They have a budget every year of $50 million. That's $50 million. And they take these cases into court and they push for the erosion of the wall of separation between church and state. They used to have a statement on their website. They took it down because it sparked some controversy, but it was up there as recently as 2013. And the statement said that the purpose of this organization, the Alliance Defending Freedom, was, and I quote, "We seek to recover the robust Christian dogmatic theology of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries." So you're talking about people seriously holding up the church-state union of the Byzantine era as a model for us today. And then they wonder why we call them theocrats. Issues like LGBTQ rights, which we thought we had settled, marriage equality, a ruling that was handed down in 2015, that could be reopened. That could be looked at again. Sometimes people say, oh, the Supreme Court's not going to overturn precedent. Don't be naive. The Supreme Court will overturn precedent if it feels that it can get away with it. And there have been cases in the past where they have absolutely done that regarding the separation of church and state. Obviously, the right to a legal abortion is on the table. We could see within a few years the Roe v. Wade opinion overturned and that issue tossed back to the states. So a lot is at stake right now. And a lot of this happened because of the fallout from the 2016 election and the effect that had on our federal court system. Now, we're a nonpartisan organization, just as you are, and I'm not here to talk to anybody today about how you vote. That's completely up to you. But I am here to tell you to be aware of how these things play out. Remember, the president appoints the federal judges when there are vacancies, and then they are confirmed or denied by the Senate. That's it. The House doesn't play a role. So you have to know where these federal judges are coming from and be aware of that because it's very important. The Supreme Court, in many ways, is the final arbiter of these decisions. Congress can pass a law, the president can sign it, But if the Supreme Court decides it's not constitutional, it will not stand. So I'm sorry to have to say that to you because I wish things were better, but it's serious. And then a little bit later on in the talk, I'm going to discuss, a little more about how you can stay active. But I want to talk a little bit about just where we would like to be, because people often ask me that. Well, what's the ideal for separation of church and state? What's your goal? And in Americans United, we really want equality for all beliefs and non-beliefs. And I really think that's what was intended by our First Amendment. The idea that there would be no preference for religion, there'd be no favorite religion, there would be no one religion treated better than another, and at the same time, religion not being treated better than non-belief. There should be equality there. The state should not care how you behave religiously. If you worship, whether you worship, where you worship, how you worship, as long as your activities are not threatening the rights of others. It should be completely irrelevant to the state. But oftentimes it's not. We live in a society where it's often assumed that being religion is a good thing, and the state will oftentimes promote that in various ways. So we don't have neutrality right now. The first thing we want is really true neutrality of religion, of religious belief and non-belief, and true neutrality for the government in its stance. The government would not take a stand on religious belief under truly neutral principles. It would simply say, we don't have an opinion. What you do is your business, as long as you're not harming others or taking away their rights. But as far as we, the government, goes, it's not our business. But we know that's not the case. We need to move to a system where it's understood that religious organizations in the United States, far from being persecuted, as some of them often claim, actually enjoy great privilege. Think about this for a minute. The privilege that religious organizations have in our society is great, it's vast, it's wide. Tax exemption, it begins with tax exemption. And they are tax exempt by mere dint of their existence. They don't have to apply for it. If you and I decided to get together and start a group, say, working on the environment, we would have to prove that we were doing that work, apply for tax exemption, and we could be denied if we didn't make the case. But houses of worship are automatically tax exempt as soon as they get together. They don't have to file any paperwork. Nonprofit organizations that have a budget over a certain size are required to file a detailed financial report every year with the IRS called a Form 990. Now, that's actually a good thing because the 990 form gives you, the donor, information about organizations that are trying to get you to donate to them. So you can find out some basic information. How big is their budget? What are their top salaries? How much of their money are they spending on a program as opposed to fundraising? It's useful information. Houses of worship are exempt from that document. They don't have to file it at all. Houses of worship are exempt from the rules governing lobbying. Sometimes people ask me, how much money does the Catholic Church spend on lobbying? How much money do the Mormons spend on lobbying? Well, nobody knows. They aren't required to tell anybody. At Americans United, we lobby in Washington, and we are required every couple of months to file these detailed documents with the federal government saying how much money and time we've spent on lobbying. And if we go over that by even a little bit, we're going to get in trouble. But houses of worship and religious organizations, they don't have to do any of that. They don't have to tell you anything about the money they're spending. At the federal level, there are some states that have reporting requirements for houses of worship. California is an example, but that's not the common thing. That's actually a very rare thing. And in those states that do have those reporting requirements, religious groups often resist them. Religious groups routinely receive exemptions from laws that are imposed on everyone else. When laws are passed that, say, for example, guarantee the right of individuals with disabilities to gain access to buildings, houses of worship are exempt. Houses of worship are exempt from employment discrimination laws. If you work for a religious organization or a religious school, you can pretty much be fired at will. And recent court rulings have affirmed that idea. So they have a lot of privilege right now. And it's very frustrating to me when I hear them talk about persecution, when I look at this position of privilege that they in fact have. Next thing we'd like to do, I think, is get to a point where it is widely understood by all religious organizations in this country, no matter where they may sit politically or theologically, that their best weapon is always going to be persuasion and not force. And I say that because there are groups right now trying to force us to live under their theology and under their dogma. And I've heard about this, and I've faced it and seen it head on many times over the years as I followed religious right organizations. I've heard them attack the rights of the LGBTQ community, and they have no argument other than Bible passages. I've heard them argue against women's rights, and again, their main argument is somebody's interpretation of an ancient scripture that many of us believe has no real relevance to the way we live today. So they will make this argument. It used to be a lot of religious organizations understood that if they really wanted to get people to follow them or to live under their particular dogma, they put out a good example. They would persuade people, and then people might voluntarily adopt that life. But increasingly, they seem to be saying, we have failed to persuade you, so now we're going to try to force you. And I think the rise of the number of people in the United States who say they have no religion, the so-called nuns, has really threatened a lot of these organizations, these religious organizations. And they're reacting even stronger with their desire to try to force us. The next thing I think we'd like to see is a society and a government that places science at the center of things. Not mythology, not theology, not wishful thinking, not somebody's interpretation of an ancient scripture deemed holy by some but not others, but science, data, experimentation, testable things. We have certainly seen examples of that during the coronavirus pandemic. How many times I have seen very conservative religious leaders quoted in the media saying things like, well, we're not worried about it. If somebody gets sick, we're just going to pray. I have the power to heal people. We can get together and have our meetings because God's looking out for us. I saw a woman interviewed on CNN who kept attending these church services, even though they had been told to shut down. And when the reporter asked her, wasn't she worried? She said, no, I'm covered with the blood of Christ. Well, I don't know that the blood of Christ has been tested as an effective antidote to the coronavirus. It certainly is not a scientific statement. We need to get back to that understanding of science being how we base our public policy. And this affects more than just the coronavirus. It's issues like what we're teaching our children in public school. Are we going to teach them the reality of evolution, or are we going to have them be taught Bible myths instead? Are we going to teach them an accurate story of the history of this country, or are we going to teach them Christian nation mythology? That's what we really need to work on, an understanding of science at the center of things. We want, next point, we want a public school system that welcomes everybody, that is truly secular, and that does not get into the business of proselytizing. Now, depending on where you live in the country, this may or may not be a problem. In a lot of parts of the country where where you're in, say, a more urban area, where there's a lot of diversity, a cosmopolitan area, you don't find the types of problems with religion in public schools that used to exist in all around the country. Where I live in the DC suburbs, we never had problems when our children were little. They're adults now, but when they were younger, the public schools actually did a very good job teaching about religion as an objective subject, but certainly weren't in the business of proselytizing or coercing anybody to take part in prayer. But you don't have to go far, even from an urban area, to get into parts of the country where there are still problems, where there are teachers who will engage in inappropriate activity or schools sponsor various types of religious activities. That has to stop. We need a public school system that welcomes everybody, the believer and the non-believer, the Christian, the Jew, the Buddhist, the Muslim, the Hindu, the pagan, the Wiccan, whatever, and allows those students to pray voluntarily if they choose, but no form of coercion. We are not against all forms of religion in public school. I believe religion should be taught as an academic subject. Americans United believes that. Its role in world history, its role in the United States history, its impact on the arts, that's okay as long as it's objective and fair and balanced. What we're opposed to is any type of coercion or force in these matters. If students want to get together and have a Christian club and they meet after hours and you can go or not as you see fit, that's fine, but you have to let everybody have that right. So if Jewish students want to form a Jewish club or Muslim students want to form an Islamic club, And atheist students want to form an atheist club. Go ahead and let them. Treat everybody the same. Leave it up to the individual to decide if they would like to be in those clubs or not, but not have any kind of a system of school-sponsored religion, because that not only violates the Constitution, it usurps parental rights. Parents get to decide what religion, if any, their children are exposed to, and then when those children become adults, if they want to go in another direction or make a different decision, they have that right. But certainly that is not something the public school system should be interfering with. We would like to see a system where religion pays its own way in this world. Again, this is an area, unfortunately, we've lost ground over the past few years. Religion used to pay its own way. Religion paid for all of its projects. But as the Supreme Court began to loosen some of those standards and erode that church-state wall, religious groups began demanding school vouchers for their private school systems and other forms of aid. During the coronavirus pandemic, many of you are probably aware, the CARES Act was passed, which was trillions of dollars in relief. And a lot of that ended up in the coffers of religious institutions, religious schools, sometimes religious houses of worship directly. For the first time in American history, we used federal money to pay for the salaries of clergy. Shocking. Now, there was a time when we could have gone into court and I think had that struck down very easily, but it's be very challenging today. And it's a risk, because if you go into court and you lose, then bad precedent is established. So we are losing ground in this area. And it used to be that religious organizations, not only did they pay their own way, but they were proud of the fact that they paid their own way. They were pleased that they could do that. They turned to their members for their support. If the members didn't want to pay for something, well, then they scaled back the project. But now we're seeing a lot of these religious organizations say, oh, we're having a little trouble here, meeting the budget, and can't we get some help? Asking for even upkeep and renovation of their physical facilities, the actual building and renovation of churches with public money. It's astounding how far we have fallen in this area. And I'm afraid we're only going to see more of it, because as more and more Americans step back from organized religion, and that is happening, that is a real trend, the numbers of people attending services are dropping, and that means there are fewer people to pay for things like the pastor's salary, or pay the light bill, or to fix the physical plant. Some religious organizations inevitably are going to be tempted to try to get that money from the taxpayer. We think that is completely inappropriate. We'd like to see a society where religious organizations understand and religious people understand that they have to follow the law just like all of us. And what I mean by that is something I alluded to earlier, the discrimination we're seeing, where religious shop owners will say, I'm not going to serve you because you're LGBTQ. I'm not going to serve you because you're a Muslim. I'm not going to serve you because you're an atheist. I'm not going to serve you because you're a non-Christian. I'm not going to serve you because you're a liberal Christian and I'm a conservative Christian. Again, houses of worship have that right. The owner of a secular business, we do not believe should have that right. And we've even seen examples of this at the government. Some of you might remember a couple years ago when this woman in Kentucky, Kim Davis, after marriage equality was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court, refused to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples because it offended her religious beliefs. Look, if you work for the government, you have to serve everybody equally. That's your first duty. And if you're not willing to do that, it's time for you to resign your job. Get something else, because you are not meeting up to the standard that is expected by the state. The government officials do not get to say, oh, well, I have a really strong belief that Muslims should not be able to receive this government service, even though it's guaranteed by law, so I'm not going to help you. Or I don't think atheists should get this service. I don't think women who work outside the home should get this service. That's discrimination. That should not be tolerated by the government, and it should not be tolerated in secular businesses. So we're working hard to rectify that, but again, it's going to be difficult in light of the changes in the court system. We'd like to see a society where religion and religious groups pay for and erect their symbols on their own time with their own dime. I alluded to this earlier, that case about the cross in Maryland. Look, if religious organizations have private property and they want to put up a giant cross, let them have at it. But when we're talking about public property, there ought to be an understanding that those symbols that are used in those cases should be ones that unify us, not divide us. Religious symbols are not a good choice for unity, because people feel very strongly about their beliefs or their non-beliefs. I mentioned earlier, a cross doesn't represent everybody. It represents Christians only. So we should not have these divisive religious symbols in the public space. And in those occasions where the government decides that religious organizations can use public space to put a symbol up, like say at Christmas time, sometimes you'll go down to the town green and there'll be a nativity scene there put up by a Christian church. They put it up with their own money. They take it away when the holiday's over. That's okay, as long as other groups get access to that space as well. So if the Christian group gets to put up a nativity scene, maybe a humanist group might want to put up a sign that says something about secular holidays, or the Satanic Temple might want to put up something, or a Jewish group, or whoever. Give everybody that same access to space. Treat everybody equally. That's okay. But right now we have a system where the government is paying for the display of these symbols and the maintenance of religious symbols, usually almost always Christian, and that is not right. And another thing I'd like to see, and I think we're working for toward Americans United, is an understanding that secularism and that secular people are not the enemy. Secularism is portrayed oftentimes by Christian nationalists and religious right groups as a corrosive force, as a bad thing. In fact, secularism is a good thing. Secularism is the principle upon which our religious freedom rests. A secular state is the state that protects everybody's rights and beliefs as they see fit. We should not be ashamed of a secular state. We should not be ashamed of having a secular lifestyle. That is a choice increasing numbers of Americans are making. It is just as valid as any choice made by a religious individual. And the government needs to get an understanding of that. And that feeds into the next thing I want to talk about, which is the use of civil religion. Right now, we have a system whereby, though we have a secular constitution, we have these weird kind of carve-outs for generalized affirmations of religion. "In God we trust" stamped on our money, "Under God" slipped into the Pledge of Allegiance, and "In God we trust" being named the national motto. And none of this stuff goes back to the founding period. Most of it dates to the 1950s. That's when "Under God" was put into the Pledge of Allegiance. The Pledge of Allegiance, as originally written in 1892 by Francis Bellamy, a Christian minister and a socialist, did not contain the words "Under God." Those were slipped in there in the 1950s after a lobbying campaign by the Knights of Columbus. The use of the phrase "In God we trust" on currency began in the North during the Civil War. It was part of that campaign I talked about earlier by these pressure groups. It wasn't codified for all currency until 1956. And the motto, "In God we trust," the official motto, again, 1950s. Before that, we had an unofficial motto that many people felt served us better, "E pluribus unum." So we are reminded, I think, every day, many of us who are humanists or agnostics or atheists or whatever term you might use, that we are really second-class citizens, that the state does have a favorite religion, that there's one God. Not that there's no God, not that there's 5 gods, not that there's 20 God, there's one God. And that you should trust in this God. We're told that that's a good and powerful thing to do. That's what real Americans do. That message is sent through the channels, the official channels of the government, of the state. And we don't think that's right. Again, we're seeking neutrality. Whether you worship one God, 5 gods, 20 gods, or no God, that should be of no relevance to your standing as a citizen and of no business of the government. Yet the government does make it its business, and it needs to stop. Now, I want to wrap up just by saying a few words about the challenges ahead, because they will be considerable, and it can be intimidating. I mentioned how long I've worked at Americans United, 33 years. It's depressing to me to look at the situation we're in now and see the ground we've lost. But I also know that I'm not about to stop fighting, because I know the promise of America that is out there for us if we continue to work for it. It is attainable. Look, there are times when the court gets ahead of the culture, and there are times when the culture gets ahead of the courts. Unfortunately, I think we're entering a period right now where the culture is getting a little bit ahead of the courts, and the courts are going to have to play catch up on areas like LGBTQ rights, the rights of women, the rights of minorities, the rights of non-Christians, even the rights of non-believers. We are seeing a really, I think, rapid evolution in people's attitudes. Think about how things have changed on the question of marriage equality since the 1990s. mean, I remember back then in the early 90s, remember when Bill Clinton was elected, there weren't a lot of people talking about marriage equality. They might talk about things like domestic partnerships or other types of LGBTQ rights. But they weren't talking about marriage. And indeed, the polls showed that most people were strongly opposed to marriage equality. But then it started to change. And for various reasons, public opinion began to move in the other direction. And now we're at a point where, according to some polls, more than 60% support marriage equality. And among young people, it's even higher. So the trend there is clear. Think about the progress we in the humanist community have made on some of our basic rights. Sometimes when I give talks and I speak to folks who are kind of, a little older, up in years, maybe in their 70s or 80s, they'll talk about the social stigma that was attached to being a non-believer at different times in the 60s and the 50s and even into the 70s, and how that has changed and gotten better. Now, we know there are still parts of the country where that can be a difficult thing, to be an atheist, to be a non-believer. But generally speaking, the situation has really improved. And in fact, polling data shows that growing numbers of people now say they'd be willing to vote for an atheist for public office. I mean, they used to say they would not even consider that. But now it has it reached into I think the mid 50s, 55% or so. Not great. We still have some ground to make up, but it's a lot better than being at 20%, which is what it used to be. So there's a lot of, I think, cultural shift in the country that's underway right now. And I don't think people are embracing this idea that religious folks should have the right to just engage in broad forms of discrimination. I think there's a natural recoiling at that type of thing in our society. So we're getting ahead of the court in that area, and I think that gives us cause for hope. And I would also say to you this: remember, every struggle for rights, whether it was civil rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, women's right to vote, and any of those rights movements took time. Women began agitating for the right to vote, and it didn't get achieved for white women anyway until 1920, and black women, along with other African Americans, were denied the right until the 60s. Some people began pushing for LGBTQ rights in the 1950s and 60s, but those didn't come to fruition until many decades later. The civil rights struggle, again, took many decades, and we're still working on a lot of those issues. It's always a work in progress. So my message to you today is, and it's not as comforting as maybe you'd like to hear, but understand the importance of the long game. And understand also that some of the work that you are doing right now may not bear fruit until you are gone. You may not live to see the efforts of this work, but the next generation will. And that is extremely important. Because, let me conclude with this. What I'm going to say is going to surprise some of you, because this is a free thought organization. And most of you would identify as atheist, agnostic, humanist, free thought, or maybe other terms you use. And I'm here to tell you today that there is an afterlife. Now, you might be surprised to hear that. I don't mean the traditional afterlife believed in by many faiths of a heaven and a hell, or a good place and a bad place. What I mean by an afterlife is that when you are gone, when you are no longer alive, there will be people who will remember you, and on occasion will speak of you. No, I don't know how many people that's going to be, and I don't know how long they'll do that, but they will. What do you want them to say? That you gave up? That you were discouraged? That you turned inwardly because the going got tough? No, that's not what you want. What you want them to say is that you were always the type of person, no matter what the fight was like, no matter how difficult it seemed, no matter how the odds were stacked against you, got in the thick of it. Did you win every battle? Nope. But you sure gave it your best. And that is where we are today. Looking to build this type of society that I've outlined here for you this afternoon. To rebuild that wall of separation, brick by brick, if necessary. Because that is what it's going to take. And I would urge all of you to join me and to join Americans United for Separation of Church and State in that extremely important work. Thank you, and I will be happy to entertain any questions or comments you may have now.
So if anyone wants to ask any questions, make sure you unmute yourself to ask those questions, or if you want, you can ask the questions in the chat section and I can read them out. So there's a question from Lewis. Yeah, sometimes I think we're taking one step forward and two steps back. How would you respond to that?
Yes, it does feel that way, especially in a case where, you know, we've had regression. I mentioned issues like government funding of religion, where we were actually in pretty good shape in the 1960s and 1970s, and then we began to see the erosion. I'm concerned about that happening with LGBTQ rights. We've been on a steady march forward. I think things were looking pretty good, and now I think we're going to see some backsliding. So again, that shows the importance of just keeping in there and continuing the fight, because it's the long game. We have to keep your eye on the long game.
Anyone else have questions? Just remember to unmute yourself if you want to ask the question verbally.
I do have a question. This is Trey speaking in. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for coming to speak with us today. I believe your talk is very informative and will certainly help push us forward in this long-standing fight to ensure the rights of all in the United States. And my question is, how strong do you find a link between this Christian push and white supremacy? Thank you very much.
Yes, that's an interesting question. Obviously, what you might consider to be the well-established, quote-unquote, mainstream religious right organizations are going to keep overt white supremacists at arm's length, or at least going to try to do that, because that does not help their image in any way. But I do know, from having read about some of these groups that are on the fringes especially, that many of them do embrace a version of Christianity that they believe is traditional, and that they would like to see the country move closer toward. And of course, that is a very, very conservative interpretation of Christian dogma. It's one that denies rights to LGBTQ folks, denies rights to women, and puts the supremacy of certain types of Christian believers among all others. One of the things that I think has really shocked me during the past 4 years is how much more open these groups have become. There were always fringe supremacist organizations out there. There were always neo-Nazis. There were always skinheads. There were always anti-Semites. But they are now marching openly. I mean, they have the right to do it, but in the past, they used to think that that was not necessarily a great thing to do. Now, you know, in Charlottesville, and a couple of years ago, there was a small march of openly fascist people in Washington, D.C., carrying swastikas and other hateful emblems. It's quite remarkable. And I believe they have been empowered by this culture that has become, unfortunately, part of the fabric of our politics, that this type of hate and this type of white supremacy is welcomed and accepted in some quarters. That's very discouraging, but they're definitely more visible now than they have been.
Here's another question. The Supreme Court gets a lot of attention for good reason, but how important are district courts to maintaining separation of church and state?
Yes, that's a good question. Lower federal courts are important because most cases don't reach the Supreme Court. Remember, the Supreme Court doesn't have to take every case it's asked to take. In fact, it takes very few. The Supreme Court takes less than 2% of all the cases it's asked to hear. So you're talking about a very small number of cases making it that far. Most of those cases are going to be resolved by lower federal courts. Now, of course, the lower federal courts are expected to follow the precedent established by the Supreme Court. So it's still very important. But lower federal courts have a very important role to play as well. And we've seen during the past 4 years, a lot of federal court judges have been nominated by President Trump and confirmed by the Senate.
Mm-hmm. So here's another question. It seems that a lot of gains being lost are the women having access to reproductive rights. What are women being targeted by the Christian right?
Yes, that is true. As I mentioned during my remarks, even things we thought we had settled, like birth control, suddenly that issue is back on the table. The right to legal abortion will certainly be eroded, if not completely overturned, within the next few years, I believe. And I think a lot of this just goes back to the underlying worldview of the religious right is one where conservative white Christian men are at the top of the pyramid. They call the shots. They call the shots for the family unit. They call the shots in government. They call the shots in business. They call the shots elsewhere. Now, some of this is a backlash and a reaction to feminism and the women's rights movement. There are a lot of people who, just as they never reconciled themselves to civil rights or LGBTQ rights, similarly resist women's rights. And I really think that the reason that reproductive rights are being targeted is because that is an effective tactic to control women. And they know that. So if they can take away those reproductive rights, that gives them a lot of power to control how women live and what choices they're able to make.
So here's a statement that maybe you can comment on. It says, I think the AU should state prominently on its website that religious right wants a theocratic, authoritarian nation and wants to destroy democracy. Some people don't know this and think that they just disagree with these groups on some issues. And it says, by the way, thank you, AU, and all you do.
Yes, we struggle like any other organization does with how to get our message across to the general public, and whether certain language and certain terms or phrases will resonate with people or turn them off or make them think we're being hysterical or too extreme or whatever. And we have actually been looking at that. We've been consulting with some experts, trying to find ways to get a message across that will resonate with as many people as possible so they understand the threat. One of the things I have noticed during my long time here at Americans United is that a lot of people do tend to dismiss these religious right or Christian nationalist organizations, either by thinking that they don't hold much power, or that they're too extreme to ever get in control. But I would have hoped that the last few years would have dispelled people of that notion, because they're more powerful now than they've ever been. And that seems very obvious. So we are always looking for ways to get that message across. It can be challenging, but I think it's very important because language does matter, especially at this point in our history. And I'm kind of an old school kind of communicator in that I write longer pieces. Church and State, which is the magazine Americans United publishes, still contains articles that may be, gasp 3 or 4 pages long. But we also know that we need to be getting messages out that jibe with the way a lot of younger people are communicating these days. So we have younger folks on staff who manage our social media accounts, who do tweets, who manage the Facebook page, Instagram, and a lot of ways of getting that message out that are not so traditional for those of us who are getting older and so on, but are very important for the younger generation. So that is happening.
So another question is there a sizable element of resistance to Christian nationalism within overall Christianity? And if so, where are they?
Yes, it's out there. It's just sort of finding its voice. Actually, we have some very close allies at a group called the Baptist Joint Committee. Now, you might hear that word Baptist, and your first thought is, eek, Baptist. I mean, I used to think that way myself, because when I was growing up, and although I grew up in the North, I knew Southern Baptists were not considered to be the proponents of progressive thought. They were the ones that caused a lot of problems from the perspective that I had. But I learned when I came to Americans United that there were Baptists who had the traditional view of the Baptist faith, which is freedom of conscience and the right to make your own decisions about religion. So this group, the Baptist Joint Committee, it's based in Washington, and it brings together various Baptist bodies and other religious bodies that are very much advocates of separation of church and state, believing that that protects religious liberty for everybody. And they've started an effort called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Now, this is a specifically religious endeavor, and it's Christians. But I think it's important that that voice is out there, because everybody expects humanists and atheists and free thinkers to debunk the Christian nation idea and to rebuke the Christian nationalists. That's not at all, anything that surprises people. But when Christians speak out and when Christians stand up and take this view, I think that does cause some folks to step back and think a little bit about, okay, wait a minute, maybe, this is a Christian voice, maybe I should pay attention. So they're getting started, they're getting out there. They've got some more work to do, because it's challenging to rise above the din and of all the issues that are out there right now. But it's a start, and I think it's an important one.
All right. Any other questions from the audience? You can put it on chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, you can ask it. Okay.
Hey, Jason, you got someone?
Yes, I can hear you, John.
Hey, Jason.
Hey.
Great talk, Rob. This is it's maybe seemed like kind of an inside baseball question, but I think it has a larger ramifications. You did mention the CARES Act, and where you specifically said that churches were the recipients of some of that aid, and I have a deep connections to the evangelical community here, and I know of some people who receive that. But at the same time, churches are among the groups that were most vulnerable to the COVID health restrictions. Anyone who worked for a church or a theater or in the travel industry, anyone who was susceptible to the effect of, basically human life, public life stopping, was very vulnerable. So I guess I'd like to get your take on what you would see as kind of a constitutionally viable way of dealing with that situation, how we could ensure that employees of a church or a mosque or a synagogue were properly aided in a constitutionally viable way in a situation like this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that is an important point. And I think the first thing we need to do is get back to something I said during my remarks about basing our approach on science, on sound science, and apply that across the board to everybody. Whether you're a house of worship or a secular entity, everybody's following and playing by the same set of rules. So that's the first step to protect everybody. As far as aid goes, there are some types of programs that houses of worship can take part in that are not considered direct forms of aid. The loans under the CARES Act were called the PPP, Paycheck Protection Program. And while they're loans, they're later expected to be forgiven by the government, so they are really grants. In some cases, if you had a true low interest loan, you could give that to a house of worship with the expectation that that would be paid back at some point with, like I said, a very low level of interest. And that might be manageable for a lot of these folks. So, and there's also, I think, various types of information, again, based on science, that can be evenly distributed to religious leaders along with secular leaders, so that they have information that they can then pass on to the folks that are coming to their congregations and being involved and making good choices. The problem we ran into, I think, pretty early on was that in this country, a lot of people decided that they didn't trust the government, they didn't trust the science, they didn't trust Dr. Fauci, and of course you had Trump undercutting the Centers for Disease Control constantly. You had Fox News putting out a lot of bad information. And I saw a lot of these very conservative ministers saying things like, we don't believe this coronavirus is even real. It's it's just a conspiracy. It's no worse than a cold or the flu. This message was coming out. And as a result, a lot of folks just decided they weren't going to follow any of these recommendations. And they're still resisting them because of this conspiratorial mindset. So anything the government can do to kind of set that straight, I think, is extremely important.
Okay. Another question is, does the Christian right have a legitimate reason to be afraid?
Hey, Jason.
Okay.
I've tried to write that 1,000 times and I keep writing it wrong. So I'm just going to ask it.
Yeah.
So when I talk to Christian people, I hear them bringing up a legitimate concern. And so I'll kind of try to ask the question as it's a complicated question.
Mhm.
But we know that the the Christian right has control as far as the laws go because most people in power are Christian, male and white. Um, but culturally, Christians have lost the war, right? Culture is more secular today than it is Christian. And yet, culture is sick. I mean, so when I hear Christians talk, they talk about how culture embraces it's not that they're, I mean, some on the extreme are concerned with homosexuality, but a lot of Christians are concerned with the fact that now we have 1,000 genders and sex is not even biologically real. We can't even say that anymore. But in but I guess the question is secular culture is become secular, yet culture is sick. We're seeing an even more trend toward hypersexualizing girls and women. We're seeing a lot of antisocial themes in the media, a lot of violence in the media embraced, a lot of selfishness, a lot of narcissism, a lot of materialism. All these things are in the culture, and the culture is become primarily won by the secularists. So Christians, to me, they talk about this. Does that not seem a legitimate fear for them, or just
Well,
us in general?
sure, it absolutely is a legitimate fear for them. I mean, many of the cultural trends that have evolved in this country since, say, the 1960s uh, are not things that they would generally look upon very favorably. I mean, think about, the 60s really were a pivotal decade in many ways. I mean, especially coming as they did after the 50s, when you had this kind of idyllic view that many Christian nationalists held of an ideal society. Now we know that society was not ideal for blacks. It was not ideal for women. It was not ideal for gay people. It was ideal for, white Protestant dudes. But they'll look at that and they'll idealize that. And the 60s began to upend all of that. The invention of birth control, which led to the sexual revolution, the rise of women's rights, the civil rights movement, the LGBTQ rights movement. I mean, just one rights movement after another. And a lot of people would look at this and say, it's too much, it's too much. Now, at the same time, you did see, I think, the rise of some cultural trends that do concern a lot of people, religious and non-religious. The coarsening of the culture, a sometimes heavy-handed emphasis on sexuality. I think we can look at some of these things and we can say legitimately, yes, they're a matter of concern. Our culture needs to look at those, but not necessarily pin them on secularism, and also to look at what else is happening alongside them. One of the things that the religious right tends to do is focus always on negatives. And sometimes when you read the newspapers, it's easy to understand why, because the news oftentimes does seem overwhelmingly negative. But, we need to look at the big picture. Where are we now in how we're treating people across the board? We still have a long way to go, but certainly things are better than they were during Jim Crow. What is our life expectancy rate? How do people have access to health care? How are we taking care of our children and the most vulnerable? We have a lot of work to do in all these areas. Absolutely. Everybody knows that. But I think any fair analysis of the situation would say that things are better now than they were, say, 50 or 60 years ago. So we can validate some of the concerns they have about the culture without buying into the whole package of everything else they're selling. I think that's the challenge for us. And I want to say one thing specifically about gender, because that's something that it's really become a big issue for a lot of these organizations right now. And what I would say is that I understand people may have concerns and that people may be confused about terms and language and not know exactly, what they should say and what they should not say. But generally speaking, in the past, when we've had rights movements, first of all, we come through them as a better nation. So the rights movements we're seeing now, as challenging as they may be for some people, I think are going to lead us to a better place. More acceptance, more tolerance, more decency, more kindness, more validating of people where they are. And that's really what we're kind of striving for. And there are people that are threatened by that or worried about that, but It's where we need to be, I think.
All right. Do we have any other questions? Again, you can.
Thank you for the answer. I think it was well done. I think he answered that question really well, and I appreciate the presentation in general.
Thank you, Tiffany.
All right. So we have another question here. In your experience, Rob, would you say that formal free thought associations are made up of mostly older white men, and the associations are declining in membership and contributions? Old people are not being replaced by younger people who they are not interested in joining these free thought groups.
Well, I have some insight into that, because I do have connections to some humanist organizations. Some of you may know that I serve on the board of the American Humanist Association, and I've done some writing in the past for the Center for Inquiry and their magazine, Free Inquiry. And I've been involved in a DC-based humanist organization since the late 1980s. So, and I've traveled all around the country, back when you could actually travel all around the country. And I've spoken to free thought organizations, humanist organizations, chapters of the AHA, chapters of the CFI, free thought, Freedom from Religion Foundation groups. I mean, I've done the gamut. And generally speaking, yes, you do tend to find an older audience at these organizations. It's something that these groups are aware of, and they're taking steps to rectify it. There's also not a lot of racial diversity in some of these organizations. And a lot of times they tended to be more men than women. Everybody's aware of this. And I think there are good faith efforts underway to change that. At the AHA, for example, the board I'm on, the board of directors, we've really diversified over the past, say, 10 years with younger folks, folks of color, getting more women involved. Now, the thing is, you have to be in a position where these folks want to come to you because you've got something to offer. And that can be a challenge, but and also an understanding that a lot of times with younger folks, they may not gravitate toward the same type of events and activities that older people are interested in. So it's okay to have different types of events and meet people where they are. And one of the things I think that's actually kind of interesting about events like this, where we're meeting by Zoom, is that we have the potential, I think, to reach more people if there's no travel involved, and it's a lot easier, just to kind of sit at your computer and do something. It's just a matter of kind of getting the word out and letting people know that they're welcome and that their perspective is valued, and that you want to hear from them. That's another thing to keep in mind. The perspective that younger folks may be bringing, that folks of color are bringing, that's a valuable perspective. You want to hear what they have to say about you and your programs and learn from that. So be open to it. I think that will help with the longevity of the free thought movement in the United States. One of the challenges, I think, to a lot of free thought humanist movements is that some people just aren't joiners. And that's why we have seen an increase in the number of people who say they have no religion, but not necessarily a companion increase to the membership of organizations like this and national organizations, because some people are saying, okay, I'm not going to church anymore. I'm out of that, but I'm not really going to go join a free thought organization. I'm just going to kind of do my own thing. That is something that a lot of people do.
So any more questions? Or actually almost out of time here. Maybe one more question, anyone?
Yeah, if anybody's got one. It's not. Let me just say one thing. For those of you who aren't familiar with Americans United, the website is real simple, au.org. So au.org. Go there, check us out. And so I edit our magazine, Church and State, and I'm still like an old school kind of guy. We still print that. It's paper copies are produced for people, but if you want, you can look at it online as well. We do put it there. Look at the work on our website if you're interested. We'd love to have your support. But if you're just following us on social media or retweeting and things like that, that's important too. So anything you'd like to do to get involved, please, we'd love to have you.
I have a quick question. This is Sean. I'm just curious, what type of understanding or knowledge is helpful for participating in of religious freedom? So for example, obviously history You've also mentioned understanding religion from the perspective of its contributions to society. Are there other things that I should be aware of?
Yes. I would say one of the things that's actually very interesting to me is the transitional role that religious groups have played, especially in European societies, because I think they are instructive for those of us here in the United States. Now, I don't know how many of you have traveled in Europe. I've been to a few cities there, and one of the things that I have noticed, and I think anybody who goes to Europe notices, is the much more secular air that they have, not only in their government, but in their culture. You don't really hear a lot of the same God talk that you hear from politicians in the United States, and you don't hear the God and country rhetoric. And there's, just a large number of people who will say they're unaffiliated. Some countries in Scandinavia go so far as to include humanist organizations alongside religion that get various types of public support, which I wouldn't be in favor of for the United States, but nevertheless, it shows how much secularism has taken hold in those countries. And sometimes people ask me, well, how can we bring that here? And I think one of the interesting things is there's a theory among some scholars of religion and social scientists that the failure of the United States to construct a cohesive, well-constructed social safety net leads people to go back to religious organizations, because they fall through the crack, or they fall through a hole in the net, and they've hit rock bottom and they're back in a church. In post-war Europe, they started to build these strong social safety nets and social welfare states. So if a person is really in trouble, if they've lost their job and they're really in bad shape, if they're grappling with an addiction, if they just really have a problem, there is a mechanism that takes care of them and helps them get back on their feet. It's not connected in any way to religion. It's just a social safety net that the state has provided. Your healthcare is taken care of. There are benefits for women, parental leave, that are just incredibly amazing compared to what we do in this country. So to the extent that we have been resistant to build that net, we're pushing people off, I think, into faith-based initiatives instead. And faith-based programs always have an ulterior motive of bringing more people into their church. So it's something to think about. And I think it's an important component of this discussion that is often overlooked. Why have we left people so vulnerable that they feel they have nowhere else to go but a house of worship?
Good.
Thank you.
And one more question. Do you have any current projects going on that you'd like to know us to know about? For example, upcoming books or something like that?
I'm not working on any books currently. I'm actually written 4 books. My last one was 2014, and that's Taking Liberties, where I talk about how religious freedom is not a tool. Yes, should not be used as a tool to tell other folks what to do. One of the things we've been working on at Americans United recently, obviously aside from trying to gather data about Amy Coney Barrett, and there's a lot out there and it's not good, is to also show how much public money actually did flow to religious institutions during the pandemic. And we have a special report on our website, which you can check out. So I'd say you look at that. And also, I think over the next few years, this question of to what extent the concept of religious freedom can be used as a tool of discrimination is going to be just huge. It's going to affect so many areas of life: LGBTQ rights, women's rights, the rights of the non-belief community. Muslim groups are going to be affected by this, non-Christian groups. It's going to be huge. And that is something we all need to be aware of. The courts are going to be weighing in, and I'm afraid they may make the wrong decisions, and we're all going to feel a fallout from that. So just be aware that that is a big issue that is definitely looming ahead.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Or is that it? We got 3:04, so I should be wrapping it up. All right, so I would like to thank you so much. That was a great speech, great presentation, very informative. And yeah, buy his book. Actually, I started reading about halfway through this book. Really good, very easy to read. Goes through the history and how they conceptualize the separation of church and state. It's very good.
Thank you so much for having me with you today. And at some point in the future, who knows, maybe we can even do it in person.
All right, there you go. That would be great. All right, thank you, everyone. Great presentation, and everyone have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate you. Bye-bye.